The city streets were quiet that night, with only the occasional sound of distant traffic breaking the silence. Officer Tom Chen checked his watch, 3:45 a.m. Just 15 more minutes until his shift ended. His patrol car's heater was working overtime against the bitter January cold, and he was already thinking about the hot coffee waiting for him back at home. That's when he heard it. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his tired mind. But there it was again. A sound so faint that most people would have missed it completely. Something about it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In his 20 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts. He pulled his car over and rolled down the window, letting the freezing air bite at his face. The sound came again, clearer this time. A tiny cry that seemed to pierce right through his heart. It was coming from behind the old Wilson's Furniture Building, a place that had been shut down for months. Tom grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the cold. His boots crunched against the fresh snow as he made his way around the building. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across old boxes and debris until it landed on a large dumpster pushed up against the wall. The cry came again, definitely from inside the dumpster. Tom's heart started racing. He'd seen a lot of strange things during his night shifts, but something felt different about this one. He called for backup, his voice slightly shaky as he reported his location. Climbing onto a wooden crate, he shined his light into the dumpster. At first, all he saw was the usual trash, old newspapers, broken furniture parts, and empty boxes. But then something moved. Under a pile of newspapers, there was a slight motion, followed by the weakest cry he ever heard. His hands trembling now, Tom carefully moved the newspapers aside. What he found made his blood run cold. There, wrapped in blood-stained newspaper, was a tiny baby. The infant's skin had a bluish tint, and the cries were getting weaker by the second. Tom had never felt so much anger and heartbreak at the same time. Without hesitation, he jumped into the dumpster. He quickly took off his thick winter coat and wrapped it around the baby, cradling the tiny body close to his chest. The infant was so small, couldn't have been more than a few hours old. As he held the baby, he could feel how cold the little one was, too cold. "Stay with me, little one," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Just stay with me." He radioed dispatch again, this time with urgent desperation in his voice. "This is Officer Chen. I need an ambulance at the old Wilson's Furniture behind the building. I have a newborn infant, possibly only hours old, severe hypothermia. I repeat, need immediate medical assistance." Tom climbed out of the dumpster, keeping the baby pressed against his chest, trying to share whatever warmth he could. He started pacing, partly to keep warm and partly because he couldn't stand still. Every weak cry from the bundle in his arms felt like a miracle, a sign that this tiny fighter wasn't giving up. He looked down at the small face barely visible among the folds of his coat. "You're not alone anymore," he promised, surprising himself with the intensity of his words. "I don't know who left you here or why, but you're not alone anymore." The sound of approaching sirens cut through the night air, getting closer with each passing second. Tom had never been more grateful to hear that sound. As the red and blue lights began to paint the snowy alley in alternating colors, he felt the baby stir slightly in his arms. Looking up at the star-filled sky, Tom realized that his shift might be ending, but something much bigger was just beginning. In those few minutes behind an abandoned building, everything had changed. He didn't know it yet, but this cold winter night would mark the start of an incredible journey, one that would change not just his life, but the lives of many others in ways he could never imagine. The ambulance pulled up, its bright lights illuminating the alley like daybreak. As the paramedics rushed toward him with their equipment, Tom held the baby for one moment longer, making a silent promise. Whatever happened next, he would make sure this little one's story wouldn't end in that dumpster. This wasn't going to be a tragedy, it would be a beginning. The ambulance's interior lights cast a harsh glow over the tiny bundle in Officer Tom Chen's arms. He sat on the edge of the gurney, refusing to let go as the paramedics worked around him. The baby's cries had grown weaker, barely audible now over the wail of the sirens. "Core temperature's too low," one of the paramedics said, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to warm her up slowly." She wrapped special heating blankets around both the baby and Tom's arms, creating a cocoon of warmth. The other paramedic worked quickly, setting up an IV line in the infant's tiny arm, a sight that made Tom's stomach twist. Through the ambulance's windows, Tom watched the city streets blur past. Every red light they encountered felt like an eternity, even though they'd barely slowed down. He found himself talking to the baby, his voice soft but determined. "You're doing great, little one. Just hold on. We're almost there." The baby's skin still had that terrifying bluish tint, but there was something in the way she kept fighting that touched Tom's heart. In his 20 years on the force, he'd seen plenty of horrible things, robberies, accidents, violence. But this was different. This tiny life in his arms had been thrown away like garbage, yet here she was, still fighting to survive. "BP's dropping," the paramedic announced, her calm voice carrying an edge of concern. She reached for more equipment while her partner radioed ahead to the hospital. Tom felt helpless, able to do nothing but hold the baby and pray, something he hadn't done since he was a kid. The memories of finding her came flooding back. The sound that had caught his attention, the newspaper she'd been wrapped in, the way his heart had nearly stopped when he first saw her in that dumpster. If he'd finished his shift just 15 minutes earlier, if he'd taken a different route, if he hadn't heard that faint cry. He pushed the thoughts away. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the next few minutes, the next few hours. The ambulance suddenly hit a bump, and the baby let out a cry, stronger this time. Tom felt his heart leap. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the spirit. You show them what you're made of." The paramedic glanced at him with a hint of a smile as she checked the baby's vitals again. Finally, the ambulance screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance of City General Hospital. The back doors burst open to reveal a team of medical staff waiting with a specialized incubator. Everything happened in a blur after that. The paramedics rattled off numbers and medical terms as they rushed through the doors, but Tom could barely focus on their words. His eyes were fixed on the baby, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with each precious breath. In the bright lights of the emergency room, Tom got his first clear look at her. Despite the circumstances, despite everything she'd been through, there was something peaceful about her face. Her eyes, which had been tightly shut, fluttered open for just a moment. They were dark, alert, and seemed to look right through him. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, transferring the baby to the incubator while connecting her to what seemed like a dozen different machines. Each beep and wire represented another chance at life, another fight being won. Tom stood back, his arms suddenly empty but still feeling the phantom weight of her. A nurse touched his arm gently. "Officer, we need to take her up to the NICU now. You've done everything you could." But Tom couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the spot as he watched them prepare to wheel the incubator away. The same nurse seemed to understand. "I'll make sure you can visit her once she's stable. What's her name?" The question caught Tom off guard. She didn't have a name yet. She'd just been Little One in his mind. But looking at her now, fighting so hard for every breath, one word came to mind. "Hope," he said softly. "Her name is Hope." The nurse smiled and wrote it on the chart. As they wheeled the incubator toward the elevator, Tom finally remembered to breathe. He looked down at his uniform, now wrinkled and stained from holding her. His coat was still wrapped around her in the incubator. He hadn't even thought about taking it back. Outside the emergency room windows, the sky was beginning to lighten. His shift had ended hours ago, but Tom couldn't bring himself to leave. Instead, he found himself walking to the hospital chapel, something he hadn't done in years. He sat in a quiet room, watching the sunrise paint colors through the stained glass windows. The events of the night played through his mind like a movie. He thought about his own kids at home, safe in their beds. He thought about Hope's mother, wondering what desperate circumstances had led to this moment. And he thought about Hope herself, fighting for life just a few floors above him. "Please," he whispered to the empty chapel, not even sure who he was talking to. "Please let her make it." As the morning light grew stronger, Tom Chen made another silent promise, this time to himself. No matter what happened next, he would make sure Hope's story didn't end here. This night would be a beginning, not an ending. And somehow, someway, he would be part of that story. Officer Tom Chen couldn't remember the last time he'd spent so many hours in a hospital. The hard plastic chair in the NICU waiting room had become his second home over the past few days. Every few hours, the nurses would let him peek through the window at Hope, her tiny body surrounded by machines that beeped steadily, marking each moment she continued to fight. On the fourth morning, a woman in a neat business suit approached him. She introduced herself as Mrs. Reynolds from Child Services, her kind face showing signs of too many difficult conversations over the years. Tom's heart sank. He knew this moment would come, but that didn't make it any easier. "We've been unable to locate the mother," Mrs. Reynolds explained gently, settling into the chair next to him. "Once the baby is stable enough to leave the hospital, she'll need to enter the foster care system." She paused, watching Tom's face carefully. "Unless." Tom looked up, meeting her eyes. That single word, "unless," hung in the air between them, full of possibilities and responsibilities he hadn't even considered until now. Mrs. Reynolds pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "Given the circumstances of how you found her and your continued presence here," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "we sometimes offer temporary guardianship to officers involved in cases like these. It's not common, but it's not unheard of either." Tom's mind started racing. He thought about his wife Lisa at home, about their 2 kids, about their modest house that was already feeling a bit crowded. He hadn't even told Lisa about spending all these extra hours at the hospital. He'd made excuses about overtime and paperwork. How could he even think about bringing home a baby without talking to her first? But then he remembered that moment in the ambulance, holding Hope as she fought for every breath. He remembered the promise he'd made in the chapel. Walking over to the ICU window, he watched the tiny chest rise and fall, each breath a tiny miracle. "I need to make a phone call," he told Mrs. Reynolds. In the hospital corridor, Tom's hands shook slightly as he dialed home. It was still early. Lisa would be getting the kids ready for school. How do you even start a conversation like this? The phone rang 3 times before she answered. "Hey honey," he started, his voice catching slightly. "Remember how I told you I've been working late?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I haven't been completely honest with you. I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen for a minute." The words poured out of him, finding Hope in the dumpster, the ambulance ride, the day spent watching over her in the hospital. His voice cracked as he described how small she looked in the incubator, how she'd grabbed his finger the day before with a grip so strong it amazed him. Lisa was quiet for a long moment after he finished. "You want to bring her home, don't you?" she asked softly. It wasn't really a question. She knew him too well. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read between his words. "Just temporarily," he said quickly. "Just until they find a permanent home. She needs somewhere safe to go, and I can't walk away, Lisa. I can't." Another pause, this one longer. He could hear the kids in the background, arguing over breakfast. Finally, Lisa spoke again. "When can I meet her?" Tom felt tears welling up in his eyes. He quickly wiped them away as a nurse walked past. "Really? You mean it?" "Come home first," Lisa said. "We'll talk about everything, make some plans. Then we'll go meet her together." Her voice softened. "You're a good man, Tom Chen. It's one of the reasons I married you." Walking back to the waiting room, Tom felt lighter than he had in days. Mrs. Reynolds was still there, patiently working on her laptop. She looked up as he approached, a knowing smile on her face. "My wife wants to meet her," he said simply. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork and explanations. There would be home visits to arrange, temporary custody papers to file, and countless other details to work out. But none of that seemed to matter as much as the moment when Lisa first saw Hope through the ICU window that afternoon. His wife stood there for a long time, one hand pressed against the glass. Then she turned to Tom, her eyes shining. "She's beautiful," she whispered. "And she's a fighter, just like someone else I know." Later that evening, as they sat together watching Hope sleep in her incubator, Lisa reached over and squeezed Tom's hand. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "temporary has a funny way of turning into permanent when it comes to matters of the heart." Tom looked at his wife, then back at Hope. The machines still beeped steadily, but they seemed less scary now. Each beep wasn't just marking time, it was counting down to a new beginning, one that none of them had seen coming just a few days ago. Through the ICU window, the sunset painted the room in soft oranges and pinks. Hope stirred slightly in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling and uncurling. Tom watched, mesmerized, as she fought her biggest battle yet, The battle to live, to grow, to become part of a family she didn't know was waiting for her. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest decisions in life don't feel like decisions at all. They feel like moments when your heart speaks louder than your head, when the right path becomes so clear that taking it feels as natural as breathing. This was one of those moments. The first few weeks after bringing Hope home were like a beautiful chaos that none of them had expected. Tom took family leave from the police department, something his colleagues teased him about until they saw the determination in his eyes. The tough cop who'd faced down armed criminals was now completely wrapped around a tiny baby's finger. The Chen's modest three-bedroom house quickly transformed. The small home office became a nursery, painted in soft yellow with white clouds that Tom's daughter Jenny spent an entire weekend perfecting. Their son Danny, usually absorbed in his video games, surprised everyone by being the first to jump up whenever Hope cried at night. "She's got quite a set of lungs for someone so small," Lisa would laugh, cradling Hope during those late-night feedings. The baby who had once been so weak now filled their home with strong, healthy cries that sounded like music to their ears. Each day brought new discoveries. The first time Hope smiled, really smiled, not just from gas, Tom nearly dropped his coffee mug. He'd been making silly faces at her while she lay on her play mat, not really expecting any response. When that gummy grin spread across her face, he called the entire family into the living room to witness it, as if it were a rare cosmic event. "Dad, babies smile all the time," Danny had said, rolling his eyes. But he still sat down cross-legged next to his new sister, trying to get her to do it again. The temporary placement stretched from weeks into months. Each visit from Mrs. Reynolds brought the same question: had they heard anything about Hope's birth mother? Each time the answer was no. The police investigation had hit dead ends, and the security cameras near the furniture store had been broken for months before that fateful night. Life fell into new patterns. Tom returned to work, but his fellow officers noticed a change in him. The hardened edge he developed over years of seeing the worst in people had softened. He spent more time talking to the troubled teens on his beat, sharing resources for young parents in crisis. His partner even caught him showing Hope's pictures to a scared pregnant girl they found sleeping in her car one night. 6 months after bringing Hope home, Lisa found Tom sitting in the nursery long after the baby had fallen asleep. He was just watching her breathe, something he still did sometimes, remembering that first night in the ambulance. "Penny for your thoughts," Lisa whispered, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "I keep thinking about her mother," Tom admitted, wondering if she knows her baby survived. If she knows how amazing her daughter is. He paused, struggling with words he'd been holding back. The adoption paperwork came today. Mrs. Reynolds says we're the top candidates, being her foster family and all. Lisa squeezed his shoulders. But signing those papers means giving up on finding her birth mother. It means. He trailed off, watching Hope's tiny chest rise and fall. It means giving Hope the forever family she deserves, Lisa finished softly, while still honoring where she came from. She turned her husband's face toward her. "We can do both, you know. We can be her parents and still help her understand her story someday." The next morning, Danny and Jenny came down to breakfast to find their parents sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers. "Family meeting," Tom announced, something they'd started doing since Hope arrived. "Is everything okay?" Jenny asked, looking worried. At 16, she'd become fiercely protective of her baby sister. "More than okay," Lisa smiled. "We want to talk about making Hope officially part of our family, permanently." Danny, 14, and trying hard to maintain his cool teenage image, broke into a huge grin. "Does this mean I can stop telling my friends she's my foster sister? Because that's getting really old." The adoption process took another 3 months. They updated the nursery, replacing the temporary furniture with permanent pieces. Jenny insisted on painting Hope Chen in beautiful letters above the crib, spending hours making each letter perfect. On the day they signed the final papers, the whole family dressed up for court. Hope, now nearly 10 months old, wore a tiny dress that Lisa had saved from Jenny's baby days. She babbled happily throughout the entire ceremony, reaching for the judge's gavel and making everyone laugh. As they walked out of the courthouse, Tom carried Hope while Lisa held hands with their older kids. The autumn sun was warm on their faces, and the trees along the street were turning golden. Hope reached up, patting Tom's cheek with her tiny hand, something she did when she was happy. A passing stranger smiled at them. "What a beautiful family," she said. Tom looked at his wife, their two older children who had opened their hearts so completely to their new sister, and the tiny miracle in his arms. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are." That evening, after the celebration dinner and after the kids had gone to bed, Tom and Lisa sat in the nursery together. Hope was sound asleep, clutching the small police badge plushie that Tom's precinct had given her as an adoption gift. "You know," Lisa said softly, "some people might say we saved her that night." She smiled at her husband. "But I think maybe she saved us too. She reminded us that there's still so much good in the world, even on the darkest nights." Tom nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Their family had been happy before, but Hope had filled a space they hadn't even known was empty. She had brought them closer, made them stronger, taught them lessons about love and faith that none of them would ever forget. 18 years had passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. The Chen family home buzzed with excitement as they prepared for Hope's graduation. College acceptance letters covered the refrigerator, and cardboard boxes labeled dorm stuff were stacked in corners. Hope stood in her bedroom, sorting through old photo albums and memories, deciding what to take with her to university. She was digging through her closet when her hand brushed against a familiar metal box, the one that held her adoption papers. She'd seen it before, of course, but had never felt ready to look through it properly. Today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the thought of leaving home, or maybe it was just time. Sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, Hope opened the box. The metal hinges creaked slightly, releasing the scent of old paper. On top lay her official adoption certificate, her dad's neat signature next to her mom's flowing one. Beneath it were newspaper clippings about her story. Baby found in dumpster makes miracle recovery. Local police officer adopts abandoned infant. But it was a worn manila envelope at the bottom of the box that caught her attention. She'd never noticed it before, half hidden beneath the official documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting shaky but determined. Hope's heart began to race as she read the first lines. "To my precious baby. By the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand words, but maybe not actions. How do I explain choices made in moments of complete desperation? I was 17 when I found out I was pregnant with you. My parents had kicked me out, and I was living in my car, working 2 jobs just to eat." Hope had to stop reading for a moment, her vision blurring with tears. She'd always imagined her birth mother as this distant, faceless figure. But here was her voice, reaching across 18 years, full of pain and love and regret. The letter continued, describing the writer's circumstances: no money, no support, sleeping in her car between shifts at 2 different diners. She wrote about the freezing January night when Hope was born, alone in a public bathroom, terrified and confused. "I convinced myself you'd have a better chance if someone found you quickly," the letter read. "I chose that spot behind the furniture store because I knew police patrolled there regularly. I waited nearby, watching until I saw the lights of a police car. I heard you cry. I watched the officer find you. I saw how gently he wrapped you in his coat." Hope's hand flew to her mouth. Her birth mother had been there that night, watching as her dad found her. She'd seen the beginning of her new life even as she'd walked away from it. The next paragraph made her heart stop. "I followed your story in the local papers. I saw that Officer Chen and his family adopted you. I've watched you grow up from a distance, at school plays, at the park, at your soccer games. I never got close enough for you to notice me, but I needed to know you were happy, that you were loved. And you are so very loved." Memories flooded Hope's mind. The woman who always sat at the back during school performances, the lady who'd smiled at her in the grocery store, the jogger who'd helped her up when she fell off her bike in the park. Had that been her birth mother, watching over her all these years? "I'm not writing this to disrupt your life," the letter continued. "You have a beautiful family who loves you completely. But if someday you want to know more about where you came from, if you have questions only I can answer, I'm ready to meet you. I've included my phone number. It will always work. I'll make sure of that. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." At the bottom of the page was a phone number, written in the same shaky handwriting. Hope sat on her bedroom floor for a long time, the letter in her lap, her mind spinning with possibilities. Through her window, she could hear her dad in the backyard, probably checking the grill for her graduation party tomorrow. Her mum was humming in the kitchen downstairs. Somewhere in the house, her sister Jenny was arguing with her brother Danny about party decorations. She thought about her life, the family game nights, the Christmas mornings, the way her dad still checked on her every night before bed, just like he'd done in the hospital 18 years ago. She thought about the woman who'd given birth to her, who'd been watching from the shadows all these years, making sure she was okay. The sun was setting, painting her room in soft orange light. Hope carefully folded the letter and placed it in her pocket. She wasn't ready to dial that number, not yet. Tomorrow was graduation, a celebration of the life she'd lived and the family who'd made it possible. But someday soon, she decided she would make that call. Because sometimes the biggest questions in life don't need immediate answers. Sometimes they just need time, understanding, and the kind of love that can stretch across years and circumstances, binding together the broken pieces of a story that began on a cold January night when a police officer's kindness changed not just one life, but many. 3 months into her first semester of college, Hope sat in her dorm room, staring at the phone number she'd memorized from reading the letter so many times. Her roommate was gone for the weekend, giving her the privacy she needed for what she was about to do. Outside, autumn leaves danced past her window as she took deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart. She talked to her parents about the letter the week after graduation. Her mom had held her while she cried, and her dad had been unusually quiet, processing the revelation that Hope's birth mother had been watching from afar all these years. They'd supported her decision to wait until she felt ready to make the call. "This is your story, honey," her mom had said, squeezing her hand. "You get to decide when and how to write the next chapter." Now, sitting cross-legged on her bed with photos of her family scattered around her, Hope finally felt ready. Her finger hovered over the keypad of her phone. She'd rehearsed what she might say 1,000 times, but all the practiced words seemed to vanish as she started dialing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Hope's heart pounded so loud she could barely hear the rings. Just as she was about to lose her nerve, someone answered. "Hello." The voice was soft, hesitant, as if its owner had been waiting for this call for a very long time. Hope's voice caught in her throat. "Hi," she managed finally. "My name is... I'm Hope. I found your letter." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by complete silence. For a moment, Hope thought the connection had been lost. Then she heard it, a muffled sob. "Hope," the woman breathed, her voice full of emotion. "I've said your name so many times in my head, but I never thought I'd get to say it to you." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Hope had imagined. Her birth mother's name was Rose, and she spoke with a gentleness that felt familiar somehow, as if Hope's heart remembered it from those first few hours of her life. Rose told her story, not the shortened version from the letter, but the full, painful truth. She'd been a high school senior with dreams of college when she got pregnant. Her parents, strict and unforgiving, had given her an impossible choice: give up the baby or give up her home. Young and scared, she tried to make it on her own. "I worked at Lou's Diner during the day and the movie theater at night," Rose explained, her voice steady now. "I slept in my car between shifts, trying to save money for an apartment. But winter came early that year." Hope listened, her own tears falling freely as Rose described those final days of pregnancy, the fear and confusion, the desperate hope that someone would find her baby quickly. Then Rose said something that made Hope's heart stop. "I was there at your high school graduation," Rose revealed softly. "I sat in the very back row. You were giving your valedictorian speech, talking about how life's greatest challenges can become our greatest blessings. I've never been more proud or more grateful to Officer Chen and his wife for giving you the life you deserved." "You were the woman in the blue dress," Hope whispered, the memory suddenly clear. "You were crying during my speech. I remember because Dad pointed you out, said it was nice to see my words touching people." Rose laughed softly, the sound mixed with tears. "Your father noticed me more than once over the years. I think he knew somehow. He has kind eyes. They see more than most people's do." They talked for hours. Rose told Hope about watching her grow up from a distance, the elementary school science fair where Hope's project on police work won first place, the middle school play where she starred as Annie, the high school soccer championships where she scored the winning goal. "I was the woman who bought all the cookies from your Girl Scout stand that time," Rose admitted, "and the one who clapped too loud at your piano recital in 6th grade." Each revelation was like a piece of a puzzle Hope hadn't known she was trying to solve. All those moments when she'd felt someone watching over her, they hadn't been imagination. They'd been a mother's love, expressed in the only way possible at the time. As the sun began to set outside her dorm room window, Hope asked the question that had been burning in her heart. Would you want to meet? In person? The catch in Rose's breath was audible. "I'd like that more than anything," she said. "But only if you're sure, and only if your parents are comfortable with it. They're your mom and dad in all the ways that truly matter. I don't want to disrupt that." Hope thought about her dad, who still called every night to check on her, just like he'd done in the hospital 18 years ago. She thought about her mom, who'd taught her to be strong and kind and understanding. "They know who they are to me," she said confidently. "Nothing can change that. But maybe there's room in my heart to understand where I came from too." They made plans to meet that weekend at a small cafe halfway between Hope's college and Rose's home. As Hope ended the call, she felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. She picked up her phone again, this time to call home. Her dad answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, and just the sound of his voice made her feel safe. "Dad," she said softly, "I made the call. And I have a lot to tell you." The small cafe was quiet that Saturday morning, sunlight streaming through its large windows. Hope arrived early, her dad's police instincts having rubbed off on her over the years. She chose a table in the corner where she could see both the door and the street outside. Her hands wrapped around a cup of hot chocolate. She'd never developed her parents' taste for coffee. 20 years had passed since that cold January night when everything changed. Hope now worked as a social worker, specializing in helping young mothers in crisis. Her office walls were covered with thank you notes from women who'd found their way to better lives through her guidance. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly. Hope looked up to see her dad walking in, still in his police uniform from his morning shift. He'd insisted on being there for this meeting, not to interfere but to support. Behind him came her mom, carrying the photo album they'd put together over the years. "You okay, honey?" her mom asked, sitting down beside her. Hope nodded, too nervous to speak. Her dad took the seat across from her, his eyes constantly scanning the room. Old habits die hard. The bell chimed again. This time, a woman entered, wearing a simple blue dress, the same color she'd worn at Hope's graduation. Rose looked older than in the memories Hope had pieced together, but her eyes were just as kind as they'd been in all those glimpses throughout the years. For a moment, everyone seemed frozen in time. Then Officer Chen, the man who'd found a tiny baby in the cold and changed so many lives that night, stood up. His face held no anger, no judgment, just understanding. "Thank you for coming," he said softly to Rose. "Would you like to sit with us?" Those simple words broke the tension. Rose's eyes filled with tears as she took the offered seat. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at each of them. "Thank you for being her family when I couldn't be." Hope's mom reached across the table and squeezed Rose's hand. "Thank you for choosing that spot that night. Thank you for making sure she would be found." The conversation that followed was unlike anything any of them had expected. Rose shared stories of her life after that night, how she'd gone back to school, become a nurse, dedicated her life to helping others. She worked in the maternity ward now, supporting new mothers who struggled like she had. "Every baby I help reminds me of you," she told Hope. "And every time, I think about Officer Chen's kindness that night. How one person choosing to care can change everything." Hope's dad cleared his throat, emotion making his voice rough. "I need to tell you something," he said to Rose. "That night, when I found Hope, I was supposed to be off duty already. But something made me take one last patrol. I always wondered why. Now I know you were watching, making sure she'd be found." "I prayed someone kind would find her," Rose admitted. "When I saw how gentle you were with her, how you wrapped her in your own coat, I knew she'd be okay." Hope's mom opened the photo album they'd brought. "We wanted you to see these," she said. All the moments you could only watch from far away, we captured them for you. Together, they looked through the photos, Hope's first steps, her first day of school, family vacations, holidays, graduations. Rose's fingers traced each image gently, as if touching precious gems. I have something too, Rose said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small worn notebook. Every time I saw you, I wrote about it, what you were doing, how you looked, how proud I was. I wanted to remember everything, even if I could never tell you. Hope read a few entries, her vision blurring with tears. Today she won the spelling bee. She smiled so big when they gave her the trophy. She helped a younger kid who fell on the playground. She has such a kind heart. Graduation day. She's grown into such an amazing young woman. They raised her so well. Looking around the table, Hope saw her whole story sitting there. Her dad, who'd found her and never let go. Her mom, who'd opened her heart and home without hesitation. And Rose, who'd made the hardest choice a mother could make out of love. You know, Hope said, finding her voice at last, in my work with young mothers, I often tell them my story. Not just about being adopted, but about how sometimes the biggest act of love is making an impossible choice. And how sometimes family isn't just about blood, it's about all the hearts that choose to love you. Her dad reached over and squeezed her hand. Her mom wiped away tears. Rose smiled through her own tears. I help them find resources, support, options, Hope continued. And sometimes, when they're really scared, I tell them about a police officer who found a baby one cold night and how that baby grew up to help others because so many people chose to love her. The morning stretched into afternoon as they shared more stories, more memories, more moments of their intertwined lives. Other cafe customers came and went, but for these four people, time seemed to stand still. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the cafe windows, Hope looked at the three people who had shaped her life in such different but equally important ways. Her dad, still watching over her after all these years. Her mom, whose love had never wavered. And Rose, whose difficult choice had set this whole story in motion. You know what I've learned? Hope said softly. Life's greatest stories aren't about endings or beginnings. They're about all the moments in between, the choices we make, the love we give, and the hearts we touch along the way. Outside, a police car drove past, its presence a reminder of how this story began. But inside the cafe, surrounded by love both old and new, Hope knew this wasn't an ending. It was just another chapter in a story that would keep unfolding, touching more lives, creating more ripples of hope and healing in the world.